It is time for our tip of the day, and this time I think it's a question that has been asked a lot, and I hope to share with you the versatility of a half yard. This is the question I get a lot. Why do you sell half yard bundles and not kits? Well, and why not fat quarter bundles? Well, in my opinion, I've been buying half yards for a long time in my sewing life. So I've always bought half yards for the versatility of a half yard. So sometimes a fat quarter, which is only half width, sometimes I need a full width strip. And sometimes I need maybe just something to use for binding, for a small border, and a half yard will do that for me, which a fat quarter usually won't. So that is one of the reasons, but I wanted to show you all of the different things or cuts you can make with a half yard. One of the things why we do half yard bundles is that you can use these bundles for pretty much most of my patterns. So it's not a bundle that goes with one quilt like a kit would be. So they are already coordinated, they're already very balanced, they coordinate, they have lots of action, and so they are ready to pick up and put into pretty much any of my quilting patterns. So let me explain that a little bit, but first let's talk about how versatile the half yards are. So from one half yard, this is a half yard that now folded in half, so I have the bolt fold up here, I created another fold up here, down here, and this is one of the main reasons why I choose to buy half yards and through my quilting years instead of pre-cuts. I get to cut them with my ruler, they're going to be perfectly accurate, and I don't have extra. I can just cut what I need, and then as I'm cutting up this half yard, I actually continue cutting it all up so that I have stuff that is cut. I'm not putting a small leftover into my cabinets, which will get wrinkled up and maybe not found again. So then when you're ready to use it again, you have to start by ironing it and doing all those things. So a half yard, of course, equals 2 fat quarters, because a fat quarter is pretty much a half yard cut, so 18 inches, and then only half the width. So it's cut on the bolt fold. So it's usually about 18 by 21. So 1 half yard is 2 fat quarters. From a fat quarter, I can also get 4 10-inch squares. So we're correlating this with pre-cuts. I can get 4 10-inch squares, but I do have a leftover that I can use for other things. 5-inch squares, you can get 24 5-inch squares out of a half yard. You can get 7 2.5-inch strips out of a half yard. And if you were cutting those 2.5-inch strips into squares, you would get 112 squares. If you're cutting 2-inch strips, you will get 9 2-inch strips out of a half yard, 180 squares. If you're cutting 1.5-inch strips, you get 12 1.5-inch strips, 324 squares out of a half yard. Yeah, most of the time I don't use them quite like that. But it's good to know, and all of those numbers and things you can find in the Master Your Stripology Rulers book. But I have often talked about how I can get 2 quilts out of a 12-piece half yard bundle. And so because a lot of my patterns use those pre-cut sizes like 10-inch squares, 5-inch squares, 2.5-inch strips, and 1.5-inch strips, I can cut my fabric into my 10-inch squares, and then I can possibly cut strips from the rest to use for another quilt, just adding a background. And specifically in my Stripology Mixology 2 book, I showed some ways to cut a half yard. So here's 4 different ways. There are, of course, endless combinations, but for example, this is how I would cut up my half yard bundle. I was about to make 2 quilts. If it is a quilt that requires 10-inch squares, and maybe I want to do a 2.5-inch strip quilt also, I would fold my fabric like this, cut 1 or possibly 2 half yards at a time, and I make my cuts through the 10, so getting my 10-inch squares, and then I'm just going to cut the rest into 2.5-inch strips. So from each half yard, if I'm making those cuts, I will yield, so I have my 10-inch squares. This will make 4 squares, and then I have 3 2.5-inch strips. They're really perfectly cut. They're going to be accurate. And so out of a 12-piece bundle, I will get 48 10-inch squares, which is a much better measurement or a number than 42 that is usually in pre-cut packages, because then you can do a layout that is 6 by 8 and that you need 48 squares. So that's one of the reasons. So out of a half yard bundle, I get 48 10-inch squares and I get 36 strips, which is usually enough for a quilt if I have something that has background with it. But here are some other ways to cut up a half yard if we're looking here at this book. So you, for example, can cut your 10-inch squares. So you can cut one 10-inch square strip, 2 2.5-inch strips. This is one combination. And then you can get 1 1.5-inch strip, sometimes actually 2. So that would be one combination. That would get you 48 squares, 24, and then possibly 12 or 24 1.5-inch strips. And yes, I would finish cutting however, whatever I wanted to cut from these and set it aside, even if I didn't have a plan what to make to start with. You can also cut a 10-inch square if you need 10-inch squares. Maybe you want some 5-inch squares. So you can cut a 10-inch square, 10-inch strip, a 5-inch strip, and then you can also get a 2.5-inch strip. So from the whole 12-piece bundle, you would get 48. Here, you would get 96 5-inch squares, which is pretty much, it was more than 2 charm packs, which usually I can make 2 table runners out of that. And then you get 12 2.5-inch strips. Great for another table runner or small topper project. And then what if you just wanted some 5-inch squares? You can cut a 5-inch square, you can cut 4 2.5-inch strips, or you can cut 2 5-inch strips depending on how many you needed, and then 1.5. So the combinations with these pre-cut sizes are pretty much endless. Now, I get asked this a lot. What if you know you're making a 10-inch square quilt, you cut your 10-inch squares, and you don't know what you're going to do with the rest, and you don't want to be stuck with maybe 2.5-inch strips? So if you would prefer to have some more options, here's my suggestion. Cut your 10-inch strip, cut a 5-inch strip, and then you can also cut a 2.5-inch strip, because that 5-inch strip can become squares, but it can also be cut apart to become strips. So it gives you a lot of options. It could also be cut into 5 by 10-inch rectangles, which sometimes in some 10-inch square patterns, that is the start. For example, my Elvira 2 pattern. So that is the versatility of a half yard. It is, for me, the best way to have a really nice usable stash. And once you start cutting it, finish cutting it all up, save the pieces like that, because they're so handy to grab for your next project and everything is ready to go.